Previously on the Proxy Market, a sealed black docket chose Mara Venn before she chose it, and her brother's debt notice gave the market a lever. Now sickness has a showroom, and the city is learning to clap before it looks at the person paying the cost. Episode 2. Premium Burdens. Mara had not slept, which made the fever celebration harder to appreciate. She had gone home because Nico was there, because the debt notice was there, and because standing in the rain outside the Proxy Hall did not count as a plan unless a person had run out of shoes and courage at the same time. The black docket had followed her there. It had spent the night on the kitchen table beside Nico's folded notice, quiet as a creditor who knew where the bed was. The buyer stood in the middle of the Proxy Hall atrium with a damp towel around his neck, both hands lifted as if he had personally defeated disease. His cheeks were bright, his eyes were clear. He kept laughing in short bursts, testing the sound of health. "Gone," he said to no one in particular. 3 hours ago I could barely swallow water. Now look." He spun once beneath the brass clocks. No one asked to look at the proxy. The proxy was being wheeled toward the side infirmary under a gray blanket, one bare foot hanging off the stretcher. A nurse tucked it back in without ceremony. The foot twitched. Fever sweat had soaked through the blanket at the chest. The buyer's wife clapped. 2 clerks clapped because the atrium had visitors, and clerks were allowed to resemble people during demonstrations. A boy in a school jacket stared at the stretcher until his mother turned his face back toward the healthy man. Mara stood near the pillar by account corrections, with the black docket folded in her coat pocket, her tongue pressed against the sore place in her gum. The docket had not let her sleep. Not because it moved. It had been polite enough not to move after following her home, which was almost worse. It had sat on the kitchen table beside Nico's folded debt notice and done nothing with the full confidence of a thing that did not need to hurry. Mara had spent the night trying every ordinary solution. She had put it under a bowl. The bowl had developed a blue ring and cracked. She had slid it into the stove drawer. The drawer had refused to close. She had held it over the basin and considered soaking it until the paper gave up. But the docket had printed one fresh line before the first drop fell. Water damage constitutes contact. That was how the market handled mystery. It made it billable. So Mara had come back to the hall before 9th bell, with a mouth that still tasted faintly of blood, and a plan simple enough to be suspicious of. Find the buyer seal, reject the assignment in person, and leave before the docket learned any new verbs. The fever buyer took 2 neat steps up onto the atrium dais. He was a broad man in a blue morning coat, too expensive to be wet from actual rain. "My thanks to the authority," he called, "and to the young man who carried this burden for me." He gestured vaguely toward the side infirmary. The stretcher had already disappeared. That was the trick. Thank the proxy after the door closed. Gratitude became much easier when it did not have to look at a shaking foot. A bell rang above the atrium. Not the category bell, not the sealed board bell. This one was lower and warmer, the sound used for civic announcements, market holidays, and punishments with refreshments. The brass clocks opened along their seams. Blue light poured through the numbers. Every category board in the atrium cleared at once. Mara felt the black docket warm against her ribs. The crowd turned toward the main stairs. Director Cel Varric descended them without appearing to hurry. He was not tall enough for the room to make way by instinct, so he had arranged for the room to make way by training. Clerks straightened. Buyers stepped aside. Proxies lowered their eyes because raised eyes were memorable, and memorable proxies had worse weeks. Varric wore an immaculate dark suit with a silver assignment pin over his heart. No rain on his cuffs, no paper in his hands. Smooth skin, calm smile, the sort of face that made refusal feel like a breach of manners. Mara had seen him on broadsheets and renewal notices. In print, he looked like a man who had found a cheaper way to repair roads. In person, he looked like a man who knew exactly how much a road could bleed before voters noticed the stain. "Citizens of Marrow," Varric said. His voice carried without strain. The atrium helped him. Brass tubes tucked into the stone caught each word and returned it polished. "Today, mister, Talon Greaves stands before us relieved of a fever that would have cost his household 3 days of wages, 2 missed deliveries, and considerable fear. His proxy has been paid, witnessed, and medically attended. The result is not cruelty, it is civilization. Applause moved through the buyers first, then clerks, then a few proxies who knew the difference between belief and visibility. Mara kept her hands still. For too long, Varric continued, our market has been described by its critics as a place where burden is merely shifted. That description is small. A burden priced, witnessed, and consented to is not shifted. It is made honest. Mara looked toward the side infirmary door. Honesty, apparently, had wheels. At this year's renewal vote, Varric said, the authority will ask Marrow to approve a careful expansion of premium categories. Preventive illness relief, certified grief interruption for emergency workers, temporary fear dampening for necessary civic responders, expanded educational proxying for children whose talent exceeds their household means. The docket in Mara's pocket went warm enough to feel through her coat lining. Educational proxying. Nico's name was not spoken, but Mara's hand went to the pocket anyway. Varric paused as if letting compassion settle over the room. It settled better on people who had never carried a fever down a side hall. There are those who say some burdens should not be touched by law, he said. I say the law must touch them first, before desperation does. Unregulated suffering is still suffering. Unpriced suffering is merely suffering reserved for the poor. That was the sentence that made half the room nod. Mara hated that it had a bone of truth in it. The market did not invent hunger. It put hunger in columns. It did not invent sickness. It made sickness transferable if someone desperate enough signed cleanly. Ugly systems lasted longer when they solved a real problem badly. Varric turned slightly, letting the silver pin catch the blue clock light. Renewal is not expansion for its own sake. It is oversight. It is care. It is the promise that no citizen of Marrow must carry alone what another citizen has freely agreed to carry for fair compensation. The proxy with the fever coughed behind the infirmary door. Once, hard enough that the sound slipped through the brass tubes and landed in the pause after Varric's sentence. For one breath, the room heard him. Then the buyer's wife began clapping again. Varric smiled as if the cough had belonged in the speech. Mara stepped away from the pillar before her face became expensive. Account corrections had 4 terminals and 1 clerk, because the market believed mistakes were rare when it made them difficult to report. 3 terminals were occupied by proxies disputed docked pay. The 4th had a cracked slate screen, which made it the available one. Mara slid onto the stool and placed her brass tag into the reader. The terminal woke with a blue blink. Proxy Ven, Mara. Status, active. Outstanding disputes, none. Optimistic, Mara muttered. She withdrew the black docket from her pocket. The moment it touched the terminal lip, the screen darkened. Sealed assignment detected. Do you wish to consent? Mara kept both hands flat on the counter. No, she said. The terminal waited. She looked at the keyboard. There was no no key. Of course there was no no key. Consent had 3 buttons. Decline had a pull chain, 2 witnesses, and a fee. She typed, Query buyer seal. The screen blinked. Buyer field. Sealed under privacy, Article 17. She typed, Query authorizing office. Authorizing office. Sealed under premium cookie review. She typed, Type review number. The terminal paused long enough to be interesting. Category review number, renewal/6/unlisted. Mara wrote it on her thumb with the stub of pencil she kept in her sleeve. Ink did not last on skin, but neither did most of her plans. She typed, Sealed by market authority? The terminal clicked. For 2 seconds, the screen showed only her own reflection. Tired eyes, hair pinned too tightly, mouth set in the shape it took when she was deciding whether fear was useful. Then a new line appeared. Question exceeds proxy access. That is not a no, Mara said. It is not a yes either, said the account corrections clerk behind her. Mara turned. The clerk was young enough to still have sympathy and trained enough to hide it badly. He wore the green cuffs of junior corrections and a nameplate that read, Tovin, J. His eyes flicked to the black docket, then away. Proxy Ven, he said. Sealed buyer queries require buyer permission or authority warrant. Good, get me either. His mouth tightened. That was not an offer. Then it was decorative. You should not have that docket at a public terminal. It should not have climbed into my pocket. We are both disappointed. Tovin glanced toward the atrium, where Varric's voice had shifted into questions from approved citizens. If the docket is sealed, account corrections cannot alter, void, reject, stain, soften, misplace, or personally disagree with it. You practice that. Everyone practices that. Who can void it? He lowered his voice. The issuing office. Which is sealed? Yes. By premium category review? Yes. Which is standing next to the renewal vote? Tovin did not answer. Mara leaned forward just enough for him to see the blood-dark line still caught at the edge of her gum. Tovin, J., I am not asking you to become brave. I am asking you to become temporarily bad at your job. Something in his face shifted. Not courage, recognition. The sort proxies learned to spot because it was the last soft thing in many clerks before promotion cured it. He reached past her and tapped 3 keys she had not seen. The terminal opened a maintenance view. 10 seconds, he said. Mara read fast. Assignment offer, remorse transfer calibration. Proxy, Ven, Mara. Buyer, sealed. Issuing route, authority internal. Review body, Office of Civic Renewal. Access contact, Directorate Compliance. Then the screen snapped back to the polite menu. Tovin's hand shook once before he hid it in his sleeve. You did not see that, he said. I did not enjoy it. That is different. Usually. He swallowed. If Directorate Compliance is on the route, the account is not a buyer account. Mara folded the docket without touching the blue line. What is it? I do not know. Guess badly. His eyes moved toward Varric on the dais. That was answer enough. The terminal printed a receipt before Mara could stop it. Query logged. Proxy access exception. Compliance notice generated. Tovin went pale. You should go, he said. Mara took the receipt because leaving evidence in a terminal felt rude after it had gone to the trouble of accusing her. Where? Anywhere without brass walls. The black docket pulsed once in her hand. Consent still pending, it printed in fresh blue letters. Mara put it back in her pocket. Crossing the atrium without hurrying took more discipline than running. Running made clerks look up. Walking too slowly made watch officers remember your coat. Mara chose the pace of a woman who had forgotten bread and had no larger treasons scheduled. Varric was finishing his address. The renewal vote is not a surrender of conscience, he said. It is conscience given structure. Mara passed a buyer in a fur-lined hood, telling her companion, Fear dampening would have saved my cousin's wedding speech. The companion said, Imagine grief interruption for funerals. Mara imagined the proxy row outside the funeral hall. 10 people in gray blankets waiting to feel what the mourners had paid not to feel until a more convenient hour. The side exit was 20 steps away. 15. 10. Her tag went hot. Not warm, hot. Mara stopped because years of proxy work had taught her that ignoring a hot tag usually meant waking up on a bench with a clerk apologizing for the necessary firmness. A watch officer stepped from beside the side door. He wore no weapon. Watch officers rarely did inside the hall. The building was weapon enough. His coat was dark blue, his gloves brass-buttoned, his expression professionally mild. "Mara Venn," he said. The use of her full name made the receipt in her pocket feel heavier. "That depends who is billing." "Officer Wren, Directorate Compliance." He held up a narrow stamp rod. Blue light threaded through its glass core. "Your tag, please." "My tag is attached to my neck." That is why the request was brief. People moved around them without appearing to listen. The market trained citizens in many useful talents. Not hearing trouble was one of them. "What is this about?" Mara asked. "Routine observation." "Observation usually starts before it announces itself." "Correct." Her mouth went dry. Officer Wren touched the stamp rod to her brass tag. Blue light flared under her chin and ran cold down her collarbone. For a second she smelled mint paste from the washstand, fever sweat from the stretcher, and the dry black paper of the docket all at once. The rod clicked. Mara forced herself not to step back. "There," Wren said. "There what?" "Your access level is unchanged. Your movement is unrestricted. Your pending assignments remain pending." That sounds like a lot of nothing wearing a hat. Wren gave her a small, almost regretful smile. "Your compliance profile has been updated." "To what?" "Observed." The word landed more cleanly than a threat. Threats had edges. Observed had rooms. Mara looked past him at the side door. Rain blurred the glass. Outside, the gutter was still leaking onto the third step. "Am I free to leave?" "Of course." Wren stepped aside. The market respects voluntary movement. She took one step. "Proxy Venn." She stopped. Wren's voice softened into something that might have been kindness if a person was tired enough. "Directorate Compliance recommends that you not discuss sealed assignments with unauthorized parties." "Which parties are authorized?" "You will be told when one is present." "Convenient." "Also," he said, "your dependent obligation match has been noted. The authority appreciates how seriously you take your brother's future." Mara's hand closed around the receipt in her pocket until the paper bent. Wren lowered the stamp rod. Behind him, Varric's speech ended under a clean wave of applause. Mara walked into the rain without running. She stepped around the leaking gutter because her shoes were still too old, and because small, pointless refusals were sometimes the only kind available. Halfway down the hall steps, the black docket warmed again. It printed through the cloth, blue letters bright enough for her to read without taking it out. "Observation active." Then a second line. "Next review, 4th bell." Nico came home at 4th bell. Mara stood in the rain until the ink on her thumb began to run.